In the harsh winter of 1884, deep in the Wyoming Territory near the settlement of South Pass City, a weathered homesteader named Jacob Thornhill became the subject of relentless mockery from every soul within 20 miles. The source of their derision was simple enough to understand. While his neighbors battled the brutal cold in their traditional log cabins, burning through cords upon cords of precious firewood, Jacob spent 3 full months constructing what the townsfolk called the most fool-headed waste of good timber anyone had ever seen. He built a wall around his cabin. Then he built another wall around that wall, a triple barrier where one had always been sufficient. The local trading post keeper, Samuel Boone, spread word that Thornhill had gone soft in the head from too many winters alone. Martha Kincaid, who ran the nearest homestead 4 miles east, told anyone who would listen that a man who builds walls around walls won't last long out here. Even the circuit preacher, passing through in late October, remarked from his pulpit that the Lord helps those who help themselves, but he can't fix stupidity. What none of them knew, what they would all learn when the thermometer plunged to 43 degrees below zero that January, was that Jacob Thornhill's cabin would maintain an interior temperature 23 degrees warmer than any structure within 50 miles, using only 1/3 the firewood his neighbors desperately burned through. The ridicule would turn to stunned silence, then grudging respect, then urgent requests to understand exactly how he'd done it. Jacob Thornhill wasn't a native to Wyoming Territory. He'd arrived in 1879 from Pennsylvania, where he'd worked as a carpenter's apprentice in Philadelphia, before the restlessness of youth and the promise of land drove him westward. At 42 years old, he'd spent 5 winters in his original 12 by 16-foot cabin, and each one had nearly broken him. The traditional single-wall log construction, chinked with mud and moss, required him to burn between 4 and 5 cords of split pine every winter, just to keep the interior above freezing. He'd watched his neighbors struggle with the same mathematics of survival. Gather wood all summer and fall, burn it all winter. Hope you'd gathered enough. The settlement of South Pass City and its surrounding homesteads sat at an elevation of 7,800 feet, where winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. The wind came howling down from the Wind River Range to the north, finding every gap and crack in even the best-built structures. Most families huddled close to their stoves, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, watching their precious wood supply dwindle with each passing day. But in the spring of 1883, Jacob noticed something that everyone else had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. Behind the old trading post, there stood 2 storage sheds built close together, separated by a gap of perhaps 18 inches. Samuel Boone stored flour in one, sugar and salt in the other. Jacob happened to step into that narrow space between them on a particularly cold morning in March, retrieving a sack that had fallen, and he felt it immediately. The air in that gap was noticeably warmer than the open air just 5 feet away. Not warm, but warmer. Measurably so. He stood there for several minutes, his carpenter's mind working through the implications. The gap was trapping air, and that trapped air, even though it could circulate, was creating a buffer against the brutal wind and cold. The principle was sound, he realized. If 2 walls created a warmer space, what would 3 walls do? When he mentioned his observation to Samuel Boone that very afternoon, suggesting that the principle might be applied to cabin construction, the trading post keeper had laughed so hard he'd knocked over a barrel of nails. You want to build a cabin inside a cabin inside a cabin? Jacob, you've been eating loco weed. But the idea had taken root. By May of 1883, despite the mockery already beginning to spread through the community, Jacob Thornhill had made his decision. He would build his triple-wall structure, document every detail, and let the next winter prove him either a genius or a madman. Before I continue with exactly how Jacob executed this remarkable construction, I want to pause for just a moment. The story you're hearing right now about a lone homesteader who defied conventional wisdom and changed how people thought about frontier survival is exactly the kind of forgotten history that we work to preserve on this channel. These aren't just tales of old cabins and cold winters. These are stories of American ingenuity, of men and women who solved impossible problems with limited resources and unlimited determination. Every video we create requires extensive research into historical records, period construction techniques, and the lived experiences of frontier pioneers. If you value this kind of content, if you believe these stories of practical wisdom and survival deserve to be remembered and shared, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And please leave a comment if you've heard similar stories from your own family history or regional folklore. We're building a community of people who respect the knowledge our ancestors fought so hard to develop. Now, let's get back to Jacob Thornhill and the construction that would change everything. The planning phase consumed the entire month of June 1884. Jacob sat at his rough-hewn table every evening, sketching designs by candlelight, calculating measurements and material requirements. His plan was both simple and revolutionary. He would build 2 additional walls around his existing cabin, each separated by a gap of precisely 14 inches. The outer wall would stand 16 feet by 18 feet, the middle wall 14 feet by 16 feet, and his original cabin 12 feet by 14 feet at the interior. This meant he needed to fell an additional 48 trees of suitable size, all lodgepole pine, averaging 10 to 12 inches in diameter. The trees would need to be cut to lengths of 16 feet for the outer wall horizontals, 14 feet for the middle wall, and additional shorter pieces for vertical supports and corner posts. He calculated that he'd need roughly 1,200 linear feet of lumber total, which translated to approximately 3 full weeks of felling, another 2 weeks of limbing and trimming, and at least a month of careful construction to ensure proper spacing and structural integrity. The material would come from a stand of pine 6 miles northwest of his homestead, which meant hauling every log back, either by horse-drawn sledge or by sheer physical labor. By early July, the work began in earnest. Jacob rose each morning at first light and worked until darkness made further progress impossible. The felling went faster than he'd anticipated. His years of carpentry experience had taught him to read a tree, to notch it precisely so it fell exactly where he wanted. Within 18 days, he had all 48 trees down, limbed and cut to proper lengths. The hauling proved more difficult. His single horse, a 9-year-old mare named Patience, could pull perhaps 4 logs at a time on the sledge, which meant multiple trips each day over rough terrain. It took him until the end of July to get all the timber to his homestead site. His neighbors watched with a mixture of amusement and pity. Martha Kincaid rode over on horseback one afternoon in early August, ostensibly to borrow some salt, but really to see what crazy Jacob was up to. She found him setting corner posts for the outermost wall, measuring distances with a knotted rope he'd carefully marked at 14-inch intervals. "You building a fort, Jacob?" she'd asked. "No, ma'am," he'd replied, not looking up from his work. "Just trying something different." She'd shaken her head and ridden off, and he'd heard her telling others at the trading post that Thornhill was wasting a perfectly good summer building walls around walls like some kind of fool. The construction methodology Jacob employed demonstrated his carpentry expertise. Rather than simply stacking logs horizontally As in traditional construction, he created a framework using vertical posts at each corner and at 6-foot intervals along each wall. These posts, sunk 3 feet into the ground and extending 9 feet above grade, provided the structural skeleton. Between these posts he fitted horizontal logs, carefully notched and fitted, creating walls that were both strong and relatively airtight. For the outermost wall, he paid particular attention to weather-facing sides, using his tightest-fitting logs on the north and west exposures where the wind would hit hardest. Each log was carefully chinked with a mixture of clay mud and dried grass, then sealed with pine pitch he'd rendered down from damaged trees. The middle wall received similar treatment, though he was less concerned with absolute windproofing, since it would never face direct weather. The key to the entire design was maintaining those consistent 14-inch gaps between walls. He used cross-bracing at regular intervals, carefully measured wooden spaces that kept the walls precisely separated while tying the entire structure together for stability. Each spacer was notched to allow air circulation vertically within the gaps, while preventing the walls from shifting closer together or farther apart. The physical toll of solo construction was immense. By the end of August, Jacob had lost nearly 20 pounds from his already lean frame. His hands were a mass of calluses and half-healed cuts. His back ached constantly, but the structure was taking shape. The outer wall stood complete by September 1st. The middle wall was finished by September 22nd. As fall deepened and the first snows dusted the high peaks, Jacob turned his attention to the critical details that would make or break the entire concept. The roof required special consideration. He couldn't simply extend his existing cabin roof. He needed to create a layered roofing system that maintained separation while preventing water infiltration. He solved this by building stepped roofing, with the outermost roof extending beyond the middle roof, which extended beyond the inner roof, creating overlapping protection while maintaining air gaps between each layer. For ventilation, critical to prevent moisture buildup that could rot the wood, he installed carefully sized openings at the base and peak of each air gap. These vents, covered with fine mesh to keep out vermin, allowed slow air circulation that would carry away any moisture while still maintaining the insulating properties of the trapped air. The reaction from the community grew from amusement to outright derision as the project neared completion. At the trading post in late September, a group of men, including Samuel Boone, Martha Kincaid's husband Thomas, and a newcomer named Dutch Henderson, who'd homesteaded 8 miles south, discussed Thornhill's folly over whiskey. 3 walls where one suffices, Boone had proclaimed. That's not ingenuity, that's madness. Man's going to freeze just as hard as the rest of us, but he'll have wasted 3 months and 48 good trees doing it. Thomas Kincaid, a practical man who'd survived 12 winters in Wyoming Territory, was more measured but no less skeptical. I grant him this, Thomas had said. The work is solid, but he's operating on a principle that don't hold. Wood is wood. Cold is cold. You can't trick winter with extra walls. You burn more wood. You stay warmer. That's the only equation that matters. Dutch Henderson, who fancied himself something of an intellectual, offered what he considered the final word on the matter. The problem with Thornhill's thinking is he's forgotten the basics. Heat radiates. Wind penetrates. You need mass and you need fire. His little air gaps aren't going to stop a Wyoming winter. Come January, he'll be burning through wood just like the rest of us. Only he'll have wasted a summer building something that does nothing. The men had all nodded in agreement, raised their glasses, and promptly dismissed Jacob Thornhill as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overthinking simple problems. But Jacob pressed forward, undeterred by the mockery. By October 15th, the structure was complete. The total construction time had been exactly 4 months and 2 weeks. The final tally of materials was impressive. 48 mature pines, approximately 1,400 linear feet of usable lumber, 67 pounds of iron nails he'd traded for at considerable expense, 4 barrels of clay for chinking, 2 barrels of pine pitch for sealing, and countless hours of brutal physical labour. Standing back to look at the finished structure, Jacob felt a quiet satisfaction. From the outside it looked odd, certainly. 3 concentric rectangular structures, each slightly smaller than the one outside it, connected by those visible wooden spacers, the whole thing rising to a stepped roof system that resembled nothing else in the territory. It was undeniably strange, but it was also undeniably solid, carefully built, and based on a principle he believed in deeply. Trapped air is nature's insulator. The early tests in October and November provided encouraging but not conclusive results. When the temperature dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit on October 29th, Jacob's cabin interior, with a modest fire in his iron stove, maintained a comfortable 56 degrees. His nearest neighbour, Thomas Kincaid, living in a well-built traditional cabin 4 miles away, reported needing to keep his fire burning hot to maintain 49 degrees inside on the same night. The difference was noticeable, but not dramatic enough to silence the skeptics. In mid-November, with exterior temperatures at 18 degrees, Jacob's interior stayed at 52 degrees, with what he estimated was 2/3 the firewood Thomas was burning. He began keeping careful records, noting exterior temperature at sunrise and sunset each day, interior temperature at the same times, and the amount of wood consumed. The data was promising, but he knew the real test would come when the deep cold arrived, when temperatures plunged below zero and stayed there for days or weeks. That's when the brutal efficiency of the system would either prove itself or fail spectacularly. To understand why Jacob's design worked, we need to examine the physics of heat transfer, principles that Jacob understood intuitively, even if he didn't know the scientific terminology. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is direct transfer through materials. When you touch a hot stove, that's conduction. Convection is heat transfer through moving fluids or gases. That's why hot air rises. Radiation is heat moving as electromagnetic waves. That's how the sun warms your face. A traditional single-wall cabin loses heat through all 3 mechanisms. The wood itself conducts heat from the warm interior to the cold exterior. Wind-driven air infiltration creates convective cooling, constantly replacing warm interior air with cold exterior air, and the warm interior radiates heat outward toward the cold walls. Jacob's triple-wall design attacked all 3 simultaneously. The 14-inch air gaps between walls created what modern engineers would call dead air space. Air is actually an excellent insulator when it's trapped and still, because air molecules don't conduct heat well. By preventing the wind from creating convective currents, those air gaps became insulating barriers. Each gap reduced conductive heat loss, because heat had to transfer through wood, then through essentially still air, then through wood again, then through another air gap, then through more wood. It was like wearing 3 layers of clothing separated by air spaces instead of one thick coat. The effect was multiplicative, not additive. Furthermore, Jacob had instinctively understood something about thermal mass and temperature gradient. The outer wall bore the brunt of the weather, absorbing the worst of the wind and cold. The middle wall existed in an environment already moderated by the outer wall and its air gap. The inner wall, his original cabin, was protected by 2 layers of buffering. This created a temperature gradient where each successive layer was warmer than the one outside it, and each air gap contained progressively warmer air. The system was self-reinforcing. The warmer the inner cabin became from his stove, the more effectively the outer layers protected that warmth. And because the air in the gaps couldn't rapidly circulate due to his careful venting design, it couldn't create convective cooling patterns that would defeat the whole purpose. The trapped air simply sat there, an invisible blanket of insulation that cost nothing to maintain once the structure was built. It was brilliant in its simplicity, which is perhaps why so many people failed to grasp it. They were looking for complexity, for some magical solution, when the answer was simply understanding and applying basic principles of physics that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. As November turned to December, the signs of an exceptional winter began to appear. The old-timers noticed things first. Henry Blackston, who'd been in Wyoming Territory since 1858, observed that the elk had come down from the high country earlier than usual, that the bears had denned up by mid-October rather than late November, and that the pine siskins were already moving south in numbers he hadn't seen in decades. The Shoshone hunters who occasionally traded at South Pass City spoke quietly of omens: unusually thick fur on rabbits, beaver lodges built higher and more substantial than normal, and a particular quality to the sunset colours that old men recognized as a warning. The Farmer's Almanac, distributed at the trading post in September, had predicted severe cold of unusual duration for the winter of 1884-85. But almanacs were often wrong, and few people put much stock in them. By mid-December, though, even the skeptics were growing concerned. The first major storm had dropped 16 inches of snow in early December, and the temperature had fallen to 14 below zero. That was cold, certainly, but not unprecedented. What concerned the veterans was the pattern. The cold had come early, settled in deep, and showed no signs of breaking. On December 28th, a second massive storm system moved in from the northwest. It began with high, thin clouds that turned the sun into a pale disk, then thickened into an oppressive grey ceiling that seemed to press down on the landscape. The temperature, already at 6 below zero at noon, began to plummet as the light faded. By midnight, it was 22 below. By dawn on December 29th, it was 31 below zero. The snow began falling in earnest. Not the large, fluffy flakes of lighter storms, but small, hard pellets driven by winds that gusted to 40 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to less than 100 feet. The storm raged for 48 hours straight. When it finally cleared on the morning of December 31st, the temperature had stabilized at a bone-crushing 38 degrees below zero. The wind had sculpted the snow into bizarre formations, created drifts 10 and 12 feet high against any vertical surface. And that was just the beginning. The cold had arrived, and it intended to stay. Inside Jacob Thornhill's triple-walled cabin, the experience of the storm was almost surreal. He'd stocked his woodpile before the storm hit, bringing several days' worth of split pine inside the inner cabin just in case. When the storm began in earnest on the 28th, he'd built up his fire in the small iron stove, as he always did. The interior temperature, which had been holding steady at 54 degrees with minimal fire in the week before, rose to a comfortable 61 degrees as the fire burned. As the exterior temperature plunged below zero, below -10, below -20, Jacob monitored his interior carefully. The temperature dropped slowly, very slowly, to 58 degrees, then 56 degrees. At 54 degrees, with the storm howling outside and the exterior temperature at -31, Jacob added more wood to his fire. The interior temperature climbed back to 60 degrees and held there. He was burning wood, certainly, but not at the rate he'd expected. Each log seemed to last longer, to provide more sustained heat. He realized that the structure wasn't just insulating against the cold. It was retaining and radiating back the heat from his stove far more efficiently than a traditional cabin ever could. The inner wall absorbed heat from his stove and radiated it back into his living space. The first air gap held that warmth. The middle wall was warmed by that trapped air and provided a second radiating surface. The outer wall and its air gap created yet another buffer. It was working exactly as he'd envisioned, but experiencing it during the worst storm he'd ever witnessed was both terrifying and exhilarating. 4 miles to the east, Martha and Thomas Kincaid were fighting a desperate battle against the same cold. Their cabin, a solid traditional structure that had served them well for 8 years, was losing the fight. With the exterior temperature at -38, they'd piled every piece of wood they could find into their larger stove, keeping it burning so hot that the metal glowed dull red. The interior temperature hovered at 37 degrees. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, huddled under buffalo robes and wool blankets, and still they shivered. Their children, 2 boys aged 6 and 9, lay between them for warmth. Thomas burned through half a cord of wood in those 2 days, an unsustainable rate that terrified him. They had perhaps 3 weeks of wood remaining at normal usage. At this rate, they'd be out in less than a week. And this was just the beginning of January. Martha watched her husband's face grow increasingly grim as he made the calculations they were both thinking. If this cold continued, if this was truly the severe winter the signs had predicted, they might not make it through. Not all of them. Not without help. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 31st, Thomas Kincaid made a decision. He needed to know if what he'd heard about Jacob Thornhill's strange cabin was true, or if it was just the usual frontier exaggeration. He saddled his horse at first light on January 2nd, once the wind had died down enough to make travel feasible, and rode the 4 miles to Thornhill's homestead. What he found there changed everything. As Thomas approached through the pristine snow, he could see smoke rising from Jacob's chimney, but just a thin ribbon of it, not the thick plume that poured from his own chimney when his stove was working hard. The strange triple structure stood silent and solid, almost fortress-like in its unusual design. Thomas dismounted, tied his horse, and approached the door. Jacob opened it before Thomas could knock. The blast of warm air that rolled out through the open door was shocking. It was warm, not relatively warm, not less cold, but genuinely warm. Thomas stepped inside, and the difference was so dramatic he actually gasped. The interior felt like a mild spring day. Jacob's thermometer, hanging on the far wall, read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was still -43. Thomas Kincaid stood in the center of Jacob Thornhill's cabin and felt his entire understanding of frontier survival shift. He touched the inner wall and found it warm to the touch. He walked around the small space, noting that every corner felt equally comfortable, that there were no cold drafts, no icy patches near the walls, as there were in his own cabin. Jacob's fire was burning, but it was a modest fire. Nothing like the roaring inferno Thomas was maintaining. "How much wood are you burning?" Thomas finally asked. Jacob showed him the carefully notched stick he'd been using to track consumption. Over the past 3 days of extreme cold, he'd burned through approximately 1/4 cord of wood. Thomas was burning more than that per day. The mathematics were undeniable, stunning. Jacob's cabin was maintaining an interior temperature 23 degrees warmer than Thomas's cabin, using approximately 1/3 the firewood. "The air gaps," Jacob explained quietly, without triumph or arrogance. the trapped air between the walls. It's like wearing 3 coats with air between them instead of one thick coat. Each gap is holding heat, keeping the cold at bay. I can show you the measurements I've been keeping, if you'd like. Thomas Kincaid, a proud man who'd never admitted being wrong about anything in his adult life, nodded slowly. "Jacob," he said, "I owe you an apology. We all do. This isn't fool's work. This is the smartest thing anyone's built in this territory." The cold snap continued through the first 3 weeks of January 1885. Temperatures rarely climbed above -20 during the day, and frequently dropped to -40 or colder at night. It was a killing cold, the kind that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes and turn breath to ice crystals in the air. 3 homesteads within 30 miles were abandoned, their occupants fleeing to the relative safety of South Pass City's boarding house when their firewood ran out. An elderly prospector named William Sage froze to death in his cabin 12 miles north when his stove failed and he couldn't get it relit in time. The winter of 1884-85 would be remembered as one of the most brutal in Wyoming Territory history. But inside Jacob Thornhill's triple-walled cabin, life continued with an almost absurd normalcy. He read books by lamplight in comfort. He ate warm meals. He slept under a single blanket rather than piled under every covering he owned. And his firewood supply, carefully calculated to last the winter with a traditional cabin's consumption rate, was barely being touched. Word spread quickly through the settlement. By late January, as the temperatures finally began to moderate slightly, a steady stream of visitors came to see Thornhill's cabin for themselves. Samuel Boone rode out from the trading post, measured the interior temperature himself, examined the construction with a practiced eye, and rode back, shaking his head in wonder. "I've been in this territory 22 years, he told the crowd at the trading post that evening, "and I've never seen anything like it. The man's interior is warmer than this room right now, and we've got a fire going that's making us sweat. He's done something remarkable." Dutch Henderson, the newcomer who'd been so certain of failure, asked detailed questions about the construction methodology, took careful notes, and began planning his own modified version for the following summer. Even the circuit preacher, making his winter rounds in late February, stopped at Jacob's cabin, spent an hour examining the structure, and revised his earlier sermon about stupidity to one about the wisdom of observation and innovation. By March, when the worst of the winter had passed, 7 families within 20 miles of Jacob Thornhill's homestead had made firm commitments to build modified versions of his design before the next winter. Thomas Kincaid was first, beginning construction in mid-April with Jacob's detailed guidance. Rather than building 3 complete walls around his existing cabin, Thomas constructed a single additional outer wall with a 14-inch gap, a compromise that would still provide significant insulation improvement while requiring less material and labor. Samuel Boone commissioned a crew to build a new structure at the trading post, incorporating the double-wall principle for the storage areas where temperature stability mattered most. Martha Kincaid, who'd been among the most vocal skeptics, now told anyone who would listen that Jacob Thornhill saved our lives. Without his example, without being able to see that there was a better way, we might not have made it through. The principle spread beyond South Pass City. Travelers who'd heard the story carried it north toward Montana Territory, west toward Idaho, east toward Nebraska. Some implemented it faithfully. Others modified it based on their own circumstances and materials. But the core insight, that trapped air between walls, could create remarkable insulation against extreme cold, became part of the frontier building knowledge that would influence construction practices for generations. The original triple-walled cabin stood for 43 years. Jacob Thornhill lived in it until his death in 1911 at the age of 69. After his death, the property passed through several hands. A family named Henderson, descendants of Dutch Henderson, who'd been inspired by Jacob's work, lived there from 1912 to 1923. A bachelor prospector used it as a winter base camp from 1923 to 1927. In 1927, with Jacob's innovative design having been superseded by more modern insulation techniques and materials, and with the settlement of South Pass City largely abandoned as the mining boom ended, the structure was finally dismantled. But even then, 43 years after its construction, the wood was found to be in remarkably good condition. The careful chinking, the pine pitch ceiling, the design that had kept moisture from rotting the timbers, all of it had worked exactly as intended. Several of the timbers were salvaged and used in other structures, carrying a piece of Jacob Thornhill's innovation forward into new buildings. The technique itself, in various modified forms, became standard practice throughout the northern frontier regions. By the early 1900s, double wall construction with air gaps was common in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakotas. Modern building techniques would eventually replace it with manufactured insulation materials, but the principle remained sound. Contemporary residential construction still relies on the same basic insight that Jacob Thornhill observed in that gap between two storage sheds in 1883. Trapped, still air is one of nature's best insulators. The R-value ratings that modern builders use to measure insulation effectiveness are fundamentally measuring the same thing Jacob measured with his thermometer and his carefully notched counting stick: how effectively a structure resists heat transfer from warm to cold. Looking back on Jacob Thornhill's story from more than a century later, what strikes me most forcefully is not just the technical innovation, though that was impressive enough, but the courage required to pursue an idea that everyone around him considered foolish. He spent 3 months of hard labor, used materials that represented significant expense and effort to acquire, and endured constant mockery, all based on a simple observation and a reasonable deduction. He didn't have engineering degrees or scientific equipment. He had careful observation, logical reasoning, and the willingness to test his theory despite social pressure to conform. That combination of qualities, that particular kind of practical genius, built America. The frontier wasn't conquered by people who followed established patterns. It was settled and civilized by people who looked at problems that everyone said were unsolvable and thought, maybe there's a different way. The numbers tell part of the story. 23 degrees warmer, 2/3 reduction in firewood consumption, 4 months of hard labor rewarded with a lifetime of comfort and efficiency. But the deeper story is about the nature of innovation itself. Jacob Thornhill wasn't trying to revolutionize construction. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He was simply trying to solve a practical problem: how to stay warm through a Wyoming winter without burning through an unsustainable amount of firewood. He observed something others had overlooked, reasoned through the implications, and had the courage to act on his conclusions despite mockery. The validation came not through academic recognition or official approval, but through the brutal objectivity of winter weather and a thermometer's reading. When the temperature dropped to -43 degrees, and his cabin stayed 62 degrees inside while his neighbors froze, no amount of skepticism or mockery could argue with those numbers. There's a broader lesson here about the value of careful observation and independent thinking. In any era, including our own, there's tremendous social pressure to accept conventional wisdom, to not question established ways of doing things, to avoid appearing foolish by trying something different. Jacob Thornhill faced that pressure and pushed through it. He was willing to be thought a fool because he trusted his own observations and reasoning more than he trusted the crowd's opinion. That's a rare quality, and a valuable one. How many problems in our own time might be solved by someone who's willing to notice what everyone else overlooks, to think through the implications carefully, and to act on their conclusions despite ridicule? The frontier may be gone, but the need for that kind of practical innovation remains. The story of Jacob Thornhill's triple-walled cabin is one of hundreds of similar stories from the American frontier, tales of practical ingenuity and determined problem-solving that allowed people to thrive in impossibly harsh conditions. These aren't just interesting historical anecdotes. They're examples of a way of thinking, an approach to problems that built a civilization in places where civilization seemed impossible. Every video on this channel is an attempt to preserve these stories, to honor the people who lived them, and to share the lessons they contain with anyone who's willing to listen. If you value this kind of content, if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and passed on, I would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or any similar stories from your own family history or regional traditions. We're building a community of people who respect the practical wisdom and determined spirit of the pioneers who came before us. There are hundreds more stories like Jacob's waiting to be told, and your support makes it possible to research and share them. In the end, the difference between suffering and comfort, between barely surviving and thriving, often comes down to observation, reason, and courage. Jacob Thornhill had all three. On the coldest night of that brutal winter, when the thermometer read minus 43 degrees outside, the 23 degrees of warmth his innovation provided meant the difference between a family huddled in misery and a man reading comfortably by lamplight. Those 23 degrees represented not just thermal efficiency, but the triumph of careful thinking over received wisdom, of innovation over tradition, of one man's quiet determination over an entire community's skepticism. That's a story worth remembering.